welcome to Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera. I'm Matthew Moore with our weekly look at business and finance. This week, 4 more years. President Obama's peering over the fiscal cliff. Can he steer the United States away from the abyss? Rival China is getting a change of leadership, but do the new men at the top have a new plan to boost the economy? And risky business, a new report warns a nuclear-armed Iran would be a serious blow to the global economy. Now, unemployment may be high, economic growth low, but Barack Obama has another 4 years leading the world's biggest economy. The challenges are clear for all to see: deficit reduction, economic growth, job creation, tax reform, energy independence, and 2 words which scare the life out of everyone: the fiscal cliff. Now, that phrase refers to the spending cuts and tax increases worth $600 billion, which are due to come into effect on the 1st of January next year. It's predicted that falling off this cliff would have a devastating impact, cutting at least 4 percentage points off US GDP in the first quarter of next year alone, sending the economy into a deep recession. A lot of people would lose their jobs too. In fact, the Bipartisan Policy Center estimates that 1 million jobs would be lost in 2013 and another million by 2014. Well, the only way this can all be avoided is if Republican and Democratic politicians can agree to new tax and spending measures. Patty Culhane reports from Washington.
The confetti has fallen. The crowds have dispersed. The Obama family returns to the home it now knows it will keep for another 4 years. Before leaving Chicago, the president did something he hasn't done often in his first term. He called Republican leaders, who still control the House and maintain the ability to block work in the Senate, all sides promising to work together.
Everything doesn't have to be a fight. Everything doesn't have to be a fight. That's the way it's been the last couple of years.
If there's a mandate in yesterday's results, it's a mandate for us to find a way to work together.
But the prospect of that happening is already looking unlikely as the country approaches what is called the fiscal cliff. All taxes scheduled to increase. At the same time, more than $100 billion in federal spending will be cut. Outside experts say that is a recipe for a recession. Republicans say they won't try to solve it now.
We won't solve the problem of our fiscal imbalance overnight, and certainly won't do it in a lame duck session of Congress. And it won't be solved simply by raising taxes or taking a plunge off the fiscal cliff. What we can do is avert the cliff in a manner that serves as a down payment on and a catalyst for major solutions enacted in 2013 to begin to solve the problem.
But being back in Washington means back to reality. The president is pushing for a final solution. Re-elected, he wants to try and keep a campaign promise he's been making for 5 years, but has failed to accomplish: to raise taxes on the rich. So it appears the election didn't change the people or the problems.
Well, earlier in the week, I spoke to the chief operating officer of Polaris Industries, a $6 billion company that makes all-terrain vehicles. It's also listed on the New York Stock Exchange. This is what he thinks will happen.
When faced with a deadline, Congress and our politicians usually act, and certainly business and the rest of the American economy and public is counting on them to provide leadership here over the upcoming months so that we can work through the threats of the fiscal cliff and appropriate solutions on long-term deficit reduction. These are difficult issues that America faces in the long term on the deficit reduction, and I think what's more likely is that we'll see a short-term solution from Congress and from the President here in the upcoming weeks that hopefully will at least provide a short-term solution that, again, in your words, is kicking the can down the road. And then the hope is over time in the upcoming months, we'll get real reform and decision-making and leadership that can start providing a long-term solution to the deficit issues. Polaris has a fairly unique formula that not all manufacturers are able to emulate. I mean, we have an innovation advantage, and we celebrate that, and we practice it every day. For a lot of our other business leaders, you've heard them. They need the uncertainty to be removed, and they need solutions to be provided by Washington so that they can begin investing again in their businesses and moving it forward.
Well, can President Obama bring the two sides together? And what else can we expect from his second term? Questions our business editor, Abid Ali, put to HSBC's chief economist, Stephen King.
Well, with Obama, it's business as usual. We've had 4 years of Obama-type policies, and that's going to continue over the course of the next 4 years. As far as the fiscal cliff is concerned, well, there's still tremendous uncertainty. I think we shouldn't assume that the whole thing is solved just because we've got the election out of the way. There's a lame duck Congress, effectively, which may find it difficult to come up with the right kind of decisions, and there's still a risk that the fiscal cliff could bite pretty heavily at the beginning of the year. Having said that, it's pretty clear that Obama believes in taxing the wealthier people in the US more heavily, and he'll now say he's got a mandate to do that. And as far as dealing with the longer-term fiscal issues are concerned, you can pretty much bet on the idea there'll be perhaps a higher tax burden for the well-off than there has been over the course of the last 3 or 4 years.
The debt, the 16.4 trillion, is it feasible for a nation like the United States to actually get a grip on that, to reduce that debt, or are we just going to see an escalation in debt?
At the moment, on any kind of policy that we're likely to see, there's a significant risk of an escalation in debt. And one reason for that is that most of the debt projections that you see from the US are based on what I describe as relatively upbeat assumptions about future US economic growth. The growth rate we've seen in the US over the last 10-15 years has been averaging not much more than 2%, but the Congressional Budget Office currently assumes that we'll see growth over the next few years from 2014 to 2018 of maybe around about 4%, so double the rate that we've seen in recent years. Now, of course, if that kind of rate of growth comes through, then it boosts revenues, it allows unemployment to fall, and that helps to improve the deficit position. If, on the other hand, we end up with growth of only about 2% or so, the likelihood is that the ratio of government debt to GDP will continuously increase. And that raises big questions for foreign investors, because if the US responds to that increase in debt by simply pursuing more QE, effectively printing money in one way or another, then one casualty of that process is likely to be a much weaker dollar.
Do we see a recession should we hit that fiscal cliff?
If the fiscal cliff comes through in full, there is a significant risk of a recession, because we know that the size of the cliff is around about 3 or 4% of GDP. The big question is, does it have to come through in full? Can you postpone some of the automatic tax increases? Can you postpone some of the supposedly automatic spending cuts? Are there ways of trying to smooth out the process during the course of the year? There probably are. And if there are those effects coming through, then that would suggest that you're not going to get the immediate nasty hit that people talk about with the fiscal cliff. Nevertheless, growth for 2013 is probably going to average 1.7 or possibly lower than that. And that, by American standards, is very, very soft. And that's assuming only a modest fiscal cliff effect. If you have the full effect coming through, then you're talking about maybe 0 or possibly even a negative number next year.
I'm going to turn to the Eurozone now. Greece is in a situation where it's still indebted. Is it time that the ECB, the IMF and the Eurozone members took a haircut on their loans that they've given to Greece?
Well, if the Greek economy continues to implode, then there comes a point when it's simply impossible to repay the debts, whether the debts are debts to private investors or whether they're debts to public investors. What, of course, we've seen over the course of the last year or so is a shift in the creditors away from the private sector towards the public sector. But, of course, if Greece can't recover, then ultimately that becomes a problem for the public sector creditors elsewhere in the world. It's a very straightforward arithmetical story, really, which is if your economy continues to collapse, there comes a point where you simply cannot repay. And we're already seeing indications of this, to the extent that estimates of the Greek government debt GDP ratio continuously go up from 120% to 150%, now to 200%. And that tells you there's something very, very unstable about the Greek economy. The difficulty ultimately is this, that whether it's Greece, whether it's Spain, whether it's Portugal, Italy, their economies are operating at levels of activity much lower than was the case pre-financial crisis. Their ability, therefore, to repay debts and to take on more debts has significantly gone down. Under those circumstances, there is effectively a battle between the interests of the debtors and the interests of the creditors. The creditors demand that austerity is delivered continuously year after year after year. What we're now discovering is that within a fixed currency regime, it is very difficult to live with the consequences of austerity. Most emerging nations that bump into the kind of problems that Greece has typically deliver the austerity and the restructuring, but they also do something else, which is to devalue. And of course, within the Eurozone, countries can't do that very easily. And that leaves countries in Southern Europe with a kind of paradox. They are uncompetitive. They therefore need to cut prices and wages to make themselves more competitive within the single currency area, but at the same time they have too much debt. And the last thing you want to have if you've got too much debt is a dose of deflation, because it means that the real value of the debt then goes up. So you've got a paradox which no one as yet in the Eurozone has worked out how to solve. It's a paradox of needing inflation to cope with debt and deflation to cope with competitiveness. You need both at the same time. You can't have both at the same time. So what do you do? So the options are: you break up the Eurozone, you end up with the disorderly defaults that you've already mentioned, you end up with the possibility of some kind of muddling through, which doesn't really answer the underlying question of how you cope with a monetary union without some kind of fiscal union, and then finally move towards some kind of fiscal union.
So do you think Spain is due a bailout?
Well, the difficulty here is that the money is potentially available from the European Central Bank in the form of the monetary transactions, the OMTs offered by Mario Draghi. The Spanish, I think, in one sense, would quite like to take the money. The question is the conditionality. To what extent does that require Spain to deliver on austerity and reform policies that might provide downside risks for the broader Spanish economy? And the fact that there's been no deal struck as yet suggests that there's an ongoing discussion about the amount of upfront pain that Spain should take in response to the bailout from the ECB. The thing to remember here is that even if the ECB steps in, even if we have the OMTs, the monetary transactions designed to lower Spanish interest rates, even if Spanish rates come down between 0 and 3-year maturities, which is what the ECB is promising to help out on, even if all those things happen, you still have the paradox of too little competitiveness and too much debt. That doesn't easily go away. So the ECB can do only so much in resolving the difficulties. It also has to rely on, ultimately, some kind of Eurozone fiscal policy response as well.
Well, Obama's keeping his job, but in China, a once-in-a-decade change of leadership is happening. The outgoing president, Hu Jintao, warned corruption could threaten the ruling Communist Party. He also said that the next generation of leaders need to double per capita income by 2020. Well, his reasoning becomes clearer when you consider that China's economy is valued at $7.3 trillion and is the world's second biggest. Yet on a per capita basis, China is ranked 121st at just over $4,000. Now, that's a tenth of its largest competitor, the United States, which is more than $47,000 per person. Well, there are concerns that China's growth could be undermined as the regions accumulate mountains of debt. Divya Goplan looks at Dongguan, which used to be one of China's richest cities.
They were lured to a city proudly called the factory floor of the world with the hope of cashing in through hard work. Instead, they are paying the price of Dongguan's crumbling manufacturing industry.
The boss has held out 3 months' worth of salary. It's our blood and sweat money. It's not like we're asking for a lot. We just want our money back.
I'm here with my children. Without that money, we can't really do anything. I can't feed the kids. They haven't eaten much for 3 days.
Security officials confirmed that the factory's boss had run away. After camping out for days, the laborers were allowed into the building, only to find remnants of their former workplace. They say their boss had tried to sell everything to pay back his loans. The empty hotels and condominiums are evidence of the dramatic turn of fortune of the former boomtown. Up to 60% of Dongguan's villages are running deficits, and the city will soon need a bailout.
In fact, in a sense, China's taking all the punches. As an exporting economy, of course, it's very sensitive to what's happening elsewhere. So, in a sense, it can't really do very much about it.
Hong Kong-owned factories in Dongguan have also taken a hit, with more than 15% of them shutting their doors over the past 5 years. At the world's biggest electronics fair in Hong Kong, salespeople are under pressure to find investors.
There are about 4,000 companies taking part in this fair, and most of them have manufacturing bases in China. What they're trying to do here is to get new business, in particular to make up for the slowing demand in Europe and the US.
China is going through a transformation. There's a new generation of confident, informed workers who have come of age in an era of double-digit economic growth. They're less willing than their parents to endure the low wages and harsh conditions that fueled the boom of the 1980s and 90s. But for now, the manufacturing slump and the changing face of the workforce appear to be signs of a maturing economy. The question now is whether China's new rulers will be able to adapt and make the necessary changes needed to continue China's growth.
Well, let's pick up on that question with Richard Harris, who we saw in that report. Richard, what will the new leadership do differently to stimulate growth?
Well, I think they probably initially will try and do very much of the same, which is infrastructure development, put money into that. They've also been trying to push money down the system, so trying to give money more to the workers. So minimum wages have gone up quite substantially. But I think what they really do need to start looking at is some of the supply side issues of the economy. Very much things like how to reform the state-owned enterprises, how to deal with some of the structural rigidities in the economy. All of these are quite important because they also have elements in them which can give rise to corruption. And that's something clearly the Chinese Communist Party wants to start off on a good foot.
Yes, you were saying that corruption could actually be fatal for the party. So it's clear from that report we just saw by Divya that China may be the world's second biggest economy, but many millions of people are still relatively very poor. What have they got to do to make sure that all of those people get a fairer deal?
Well, the other thing the party's been very concerned about is the wealth gap, because clearly there's some extremely wealthy people that have been made wealthy by China's growth. There's a middle class that's developing now, which is feeling reasonably comfortable, but there's also a very big underclass. Now, the underclass, such as the rural poor, I think are likely to probably be happy with reasonable growth over time. It's almost the sandwich class in between the rural poor and the middle class in the cities that are doing much better. Those are the areas that I think we could well see some social problems on, and those are the areas that the government are going to have to try and push down some of the income, just so that some of the income is spread more widely. That will also be good for consumption in the economy.
China desperately wants to move from making vast quantities of cheap goods to more high-end, high-value products, a bit like the Germans. How far have they progressed with that?
Well, you see, the thing is at the moment, China is very susceptible to slowdowns in the US and Europe. And I think everybody, both within China and outside China, are really looking to try and see China take some of the more load of this economic growth. They need to increase consumer demand. Now, there's no doubt that consumer demand actually is increasing quite fast. The main problem is that you've got to cover that over a large number of people, 1.3 billion people now in China. And the numbers are still quite small. But if you go into a Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's in Beijing or Shanghai, they are absolutely packed. So there's no doubt that the Chinese consumer wants to consume, but it's still very early days and the numbers are still very small compared to the size of the economy.
Richard, I just want to turn to China's relationship with the United States now. Do you think Beijing will be relieved to see President Obama's kept his job, given that Mitt Romney had promised to label China a currency manipulator?
Well, I think you've pretty well put your finger on it. The best result for China was another Obama presidency. And indeed, that's probably why he got re-elected, because he was the guy people knew most about. Romney, I think, certainly would have sought more accountability from China on its actions, and therefore was less of the preferred candidate. So I certainly think they're pleased to see Obama. I think Obama will probably carry on his policies. I think he may have to get a little bit tougher, certainly in terms of some of the foreign issues and perhaps on the currency, but absolutely nothing like Romney, and probably nothing that the Chinese aren't expecting anyway.
Richard Harris in Hong Kong, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. Well, let's turn to one of President Obama's biggest foreign policy challenges, which some predict could transform into a massive economic one: Iran. A US think tank's been crunching the numbers and predicts that if Iran did get nuclear weapons, we could see oil prices jump quickly by as much as $27 a barrel. And they'd keep rising, so that in 3 years, US petrol prices would be 30% more expensive. That would force up inflation and would kill off 1 million jobs and take a big bite out of the economy. Well, Mike Makovsky is from the Bipartisan Policy Center, the group that published that report. He joins us from Washington. Mike, tell us briefly about your group and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. We're bipartisan. The organization is a bipartisan group filled with very prominent foreign policy experts and other leading, former generals and congressmen and senators and so on. And the purpose is to highlight the risks of a nuclear Iran and to try to expand the debate a little bit.
Let's turn to your report now, Mike, and it looks at various scenarios in which Iran is a nuclear-armed nation and then looks at the economic impact. Now, in each case, you predict the economic outcomes to be incredibly damaging. Are you making an economic case for President Obama to order a preemptive strike on Iran?
No, we're not. We're just trying to fill in some of the debate. I mean, again, there are people who highlight the economic risks of tough action against Iran, such as tough sanctions or even military conflict. We're saying those are legitimate concerns, but when we're deciding, policymakers must also consider the economic implications of inaction, meaning permitting a nuclear Iran. So we just think that policymakers need to understand both sides of the economic argument, but we're not arguing that economics should be driving our policy. We're just saying, it's been raised, it's an important consideration. Right. We actually think strategic considerations and other...
In one conflict scenario, you're predicting that if Saudi Arabia and Iran had a nuclear exchange, prices could double. Now, Iran hasn't started a war with its neighbours in living memory. So some might say, your report is scaremongering. They're right, aren't they?
They're absolutely wrong. I mean, Iran is the chief sponsor of terrorism, certainly in the region, if not in the world. They've been violating UN Security Council sanctions for many years on their nuclear program. By no means is Iran a peace-loving country. If it was, we wouldn't be in this problem right now.
Well, the Iranians would say, of course, that their nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. Now, we're not going to get into that here, but let's assume you're right and that they're hiding their true intentions. What's the worst case scenario for global oil prices, and what would be the economic impact?
Yeah, just to clarify, I think the Iranian regime is one of the leading murderers and terrorists in the world, and they oppress their own people, and they also have committed a lot of terrorism against Americans and other countries. So their word is not to be really taken at face value, and they've been shown to always hide their program.
We're going to leave that for a different program. This being a business program,
sure.
Let's go back to that.
Oh, sure.
In the worst case scenario, where do you see global oil prices, US GDP, US petrol prices?
We're saying oil markets react to changes in supply and demand. They also react to changes in expectations of supply and demand. The worst scenario is absolutely would be some nuclear exchange. Right now, neither Iran or Saudi Arabia has nuclear weapons, but the Saudis have conveyed to us, we know this, it's been publicized, that if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, they will get nuclear weapons. Then, therefore, there is some risk of nuclear conflict between those two countries, even if we think the probability is still relatively low. If that high impact, low probability event actually happened, then you could see, and there was a nuclear exchange, God forbid, then of course you would see a dramatic disruption to oil prices, to the oil supply from the region, and it would be, oil prices could easily double. It would have a dramatic impact on U.S. GDP and unemployment. Now, I should just add one caveat. Current models do not exist to really address such an Armageddon situation. But, policymakers need to take that into consideration, such low probability but high impact events.
President Obama has another 4 years. What advice would you give him for his second term in office on this matter?
I think he has to do whatever is necessary to prevent a nuclear Iran, and we believe the best way to do that is to pursue tough sanctions, a much more credible military option, and then hopefully if you do those first two better, then we increase the chances of a diplomatic solution, which is what we all want to this crisis.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week, but if you want to get in touch, here's how you can do it. Contact our business editor, Abid Oliver Ali, all one word. And if you're not on Twitter, just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And while you're online, head to aljazeera.com/business and link on to the CTC page where we put up all our episodes for you to watch in full. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Matthew Moore. From the whole team, thanks very much for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.